Ambassador Michael Novak is a theologian, author, and former U.S. ambassador under Ronald Reagan for 3 missions. He has served both Republican and Democratic administrations since 1972. He wrote speeches for John F. Kennedy and Robert Kennedy, and later was a speechwriter for Edmund Muskie, George McGovern, Sargent Shriver, Senator Scoop Jackson, and Steve Forbes during their respective presidential campaigns. Most notably, Mr. Novak was awarded the $1 Million Templeton Prize for his original work relating theology to economics. He presented the Templeton Address at Westminster Abbey in the presence of Margaret Thatcher and a distinguished audience of about 1,000 people. Mr. Novak was privileged to call and to be called a friend by Lady Thatcher. In addition, when asked if he had any lay friends, Pope John Paul II regularly mentioned 4 or 5 names from around the world, always including Mr. Novak. John Paul II invited Michael to lunch or dinner some 10 times between 1991 and his death in 2005. Mr. Novak's work has been honored by several nations and cities, including Bratislava, Slovakia, Aix-en-Provence in France. He has received 28 honorary degrees and held 3 academic chairs: the Laban Watson Chair at Syracuse University, the Martha Welch Chair at the University of Notre Dame, and the George Frederick Jewett Chair at the American Enterprise Institute in Washington, D.C., the latter from which he is in semi-retirement after 30 years of service. Mr. Novak has written over 30 books on the relation of culture, politics, and economics, many of them award-winning. Sports Illustrated named his book The Joy of Sports one of the 100 best books of all time. Among his other titles are Business as a Calling, Tell Me Why, a dialogue between him and his daughter Yana about God, sex, and ethics. His masterpiece, The Spirit of Democratic Capitalism, has been translated around the world. One reviewer called it, quote, one of those rare books that actually changed the world. We're privileged to have Michael Novak visit us today. His topic today is the Christian conception of human nature. Mr. Novak.
I thought before coming here that this was the distinguished Mormon University. Then when I saw everybody sitting in the back, I thought it really is Catholic after all. I thought my subject is what I like to call, are you hearing okay? Because I do have a light voice, and if I go quieter, can you still hear okay? That's a good system, okay. What I like to call the 2 wings by which the American eagle took flight. One was, of course, reason, but reason understood as common sense, using your practical experience of the world as the main form of reason. Not academic reason, but often trained and sharpened by academic reason. And secondly, faith. I call it humble faith because you'll remember that in the beginning, practically every one of the new colonies had an established church. And they were quite often cruel, not to say intolerant, toward one another. In Boston, the Quakers being stripped and covered with tar and feathers and driven out of town. Hot tar and feathers is not a pleasant way to go out of town. Until they finally became embarrassed. But this is no way for Christian people to behave. It's impossible to justify. And so they try to find a way for religious liberty. Well, my point is that as our nation approached, as our people approached the War of Independence, they were facing the greatest navy on the face of the earth without question, arguably the greatest army. Americans didn't have an army, they didn't have a navy, and they didn't have a munitions factory on this side of the water. Now, in such circumstances, it doesn't make common sense to go to war. It's not the reasonable thing to do, as many people pointed out in Philadelphia in June of 1976. In such circumstances, it's wise to have a complete trust in divine providence, which they did. And they thought, you may think it's a crazy thought, but they thought, it's a Jewish and a Christian thought, that the reason the Creator made the whole cosmos and all its vast spaces, and of course they didn't appreciate half of its size as we do today, is so that somewhere within it there would be a creature made in His image, God's image, able to understand and appreciate and to become friends, to walk in friendship with God. The whole world was made for friendship. That's why the capital city, Philadelphia, love of brothers, friendship, founded by the Friends, naturally, the Quakers, seemed so appropriate to them. And they believed that friendship requires liberty. The Lord did not want the friendship of slaves who were coerced into being His, quote, friends. He didn't want submission down on the ground with heads to the floor. He wanted free women and free men standing erect to say yes and follow in His way, while they could say no, as a great many did. The whole premise is, and therefore they thought that any group of people that fights for liberty and for their own dignity is with the grain of the Creator. And it's unlikely that the Creator would abandon them. Could happen, the Lord abandoned His Son, so to speak. Christianity, Judaism, the Church of Latter-day Saints are not Pollyannish. They don't think everything has a happy ending. They think you go through lots of suffering. And sometimes the good guys lose and take defeat. But anyway, they believed that's what God wanted them to do, and they'd give it the best shot they had. And you can't ask for more than that. And they had a chance to succeed, because the British were making so many mistakes at every step of the way, as if led by a divine providence, one of the founders wrote. The British did exactly the thing that most helped the Americans, and avoided doing exactly the thing that would have ended the war before there was a war. For example, if they had simply divided the country and worked on one part and another part, there'd been no chance of a war of independence. And it should have been very easy to divide us. Even in those days, people from Georgia did not especially like people from Massachusetts. Even then, as today. I'm going to try to establish the extent to which the founding was, in the Jewish and Christian tradition, something you will very well recognize and be part of. And I need to emphasize, this is crazy that you should have to emphasize this. It should be so obvious. But the historians of the last 150 years have mostly been people not so interested in religion. Not to say a good many who think it's childish to believe in God, and bizarre to believe in the God of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. And so they haven't paid much attention to religion. Gordon Wood, the greatest of our living historians of the American founding, has written recently that it seems implausible to believe that most of historians misrepresented American history, but they did in the last 100 years. Trying to make the American eagle fly on one wing, the philosophy of the Enlightenment, as if religion is an intrusion or even a disease that you have to isolate. If you read Supreme Court decisions of the last 40 years, that's where they really read, as if religion's a great menace, a disease which can destroy the fiber of the body public. It's crazy. Now, the first part of my remarks is going to be difficult to follow, I admit that, but I think it's an important part of the argument. I'm going to start there while you're still reasonably fresh By the time I wear you down, I'll tell you some stories that'll make it a little bit easier to. It reminds me, my first teaching position after graduate school was at Stanford University. And I just thought Stanford was the most amazing place. We were growing lemons and oranges out in the trees in our yard. Winter was over before it began, and by February we were already going to the pool. And I learned a very good lesson my first year. I had a very small seminar of 9 or 10. When we met in one of the buildings, one of the young women in the class suggested, why don't we go to the pool? It was such a beautiful day. Well, I was very young and naive, and I said, sure. And we went to the pool to resume the seminar, and one of the young women, twirling her nose plug so, saw it fly out of her hand and plop into the pool, whereupon 4 young guys jumped up to go get it for her. And she said, stop. She said, I want Professor Novak to do it. Now, I tell you, I was very young and naive, and I thought this was rather neat, you know. And I said, why me? And she said, because nobody I know can dive down deeper, stay down longer, and come up drier. So I'm just telling you that as a warning, because this first part is a little bit hard. Now, Virginia led the way in articulating the grounds of religious liberty, probably the most novel part. You know on the seal of the United States it says Novus Ordo Seclorum, the new order of the ages. The Americans were very conscious of building a form of government different from anything that had transpired before, and they made a study of all the constitutions, all the republics, John Adams particularly, but he wasn't alone. So they knew what they were talking about. And John Adams later wrote that the American Revolution was finished before the War of Independence began. In other words, the American people had started to think of themselves in a new way and to want to be governed in a new way, a model without precedent on the face of the earth. And one of the most novel things, there are many novelties, but one of the most novel things they did was to build the country on a conception of religious liberty which has no equal anywhere in the world before that, and has now become the model commended to the whole world, something like it anyway, analogous to it. And here's the way they argued for it. Now, just follow this argument and see if you can possibly do this just with philosophy. I don't think so. I think you can only get to this point if you think out of the Jewish and Christian tradition. Now, I don't mean you have to be Jewish or Christian or Church of Latter-day Saints. But you only understand some of these ideas if you come out of that tradition. Or to be fair, maybe I should say family of traditions, family resemblances. Now, there are 3 documents I want to mention. The Virginia Declaration of Rights of 1776. Then Thomas Jefferson's Bill for Religious Liberty in Virginia of 1779. It didn't become a statute for another approximately 10 years, 9 years. But the bill first. And then Madison's remonstrance in favor of religious liberty against the government, his protest against Governor Patrick Henry in 1885. Now, these are the 3 foundational documents on which the ACLU, when it means to close down any religious sign in the public sphere, cites. I don't think they don't understand. I think they don't get it. But here's the way they go. In the Virginia Declaration, George Mason, with help from the young James Madison, defines religion, or the duty which we owe to our Creator. That's the way they thought of it. It's a duty which we owe to our Creator, and they thought that was a self-evident truth. When anyone who grasps what it is to be a creature and totally dependent upon a Creator an infinite capacity for insight, intelligence, and understanding, and an infinite capacity for friendship, for love. Anybody who grasps that relation between the creature and the creator must see that the creature has a duty to say thank you and to give praise or worship. I mean, it's only just to look, if there's a better talent than you in the room and you don't recognize it, something's wrong with your sense of honesty. And so if we are aware of being in the presence of the Creator, something would be very wrong with us if we don't recognize the huge distance between us. That's the way they thought of religion. And just to show you how strong that is, that's also the definition Webster gives in the Webster Dictionary of 1828. So this is the conception that governs the founding period. Religion is the duty which we owe to our Creator. Now, the Declaration says then, Mason's Declaration of 1776, religion, or the duty which we owe to our Creator, and the manner of discharging it, can be directed only by reason and conviction, not by force or violence. Now just think about that. This duty, this religion, this duty of religion, creature to creator, can only be discharged by reason and conviction, recognized by reason and conviction. In other words, you're not forced to submit. The great symbol of Islam is submission. You're not asked, do you accept this in conscience? You're asked, do you submit to the will of Allah? And even Allah does not necessarily follow reason or conviction. Allah follows will. It's the will of Allah that counts. Reason or conviction would be a limitation on His omnipotence. That's the Muslim way of thinking of it. I'm not an expert on that, but I think at least that's the only way I can make sense out of the documents I read. Now ask this question to yourself. There are many conceptions of God in the religious history of the human race. Which of those conceptions makes sense of this proposition? That the manner of discharging our duty must be by way of reason and conviction. How many religions think of God as the source of reason and conviction, the great fire of insight and judgment in which we participate? It's a special kind of God, if you follow me. And it's a special conception of the human being, that the human being is able to share in the light of God's reason sufficiently to understand, to know of His presence, and to give thanks and worship in a manner that answers to reason and conviction. This is what God would have us do. Our God is, as it says in the prologue of St. John's Gospel, is the Logos, the great insight, the spirit of understanding in all things. Look wherever you will, in your chemistry classes, or in your history classes, or in your physics classes, and look for the principles of light, which make those disciplines intellectual disciplines. Try to figure out the secrets that make these things. We always understand there are secrets, and that they can be broken by the human being. That's what science is all about. If you didn't believe that, if certain people in the human race hadn't believed that for 5,000 years, we would have never had modern science. Alfred North Whitehead's History of Science. It's his thesis that without the Jewish and Christian God, whose intelligence and light, there would have been no science. And without its teaching that human beings are meant to participate in that, there would have been no science. So it's not an accident that this tradition builds universities. I mean, that's ours. That's our terrain. That's what we think of God and of man. The inner principle is the principle of intellect. By intellect, I mean the capacity to understand. By that, I mean, you ever walked up to a group and you come in a little bit late, you miss one of the premises, and all of a sudden there's the punchline and everybody laughs and you don't get it, and you laugh too. And then you nudge somebody and said, I don't get it. And they give you the premise, yeah, and then you suddenly get it. Well, okay, that's the insight. Now you get it too. Now you're sharing it too. The whole group shared in it. participate in it. Okay, let me then move to a second step. So we have a God who it is our duty to worship and to give thanks to, according to reason and conviction. Now, what kind of characteristics must this God have? Do you follow what I'm doing? Taking a step, just picking out what the Declaration says, how it defines religious liberty and religion, and then try to think what God in the history of humanity meets this test. Most writers take Jefferson and Madison as lodestones on religious liberty. That's the secular way of doing it. Take the most secular, take the top 100 people in the American Revolution, the 56 who signed the Declaration, the 70-some who signed the, with overlap, the Constitution, and throw in Abigail and Adams and Tom Paine and George Mason and some others who didn't sign these documents. Get the top 100. Okay, if you have 115 or 150, I'm not trying to institute a canonical number here. You will find, if you look, that of these, Jefferson for certain, I think Madison not, but Jefferson for certain is one of the 3 or 4 least religious, least traditional. He's very religious. But he's the one who most consciously separates himself from biblical religion. But he's over at an extreme. He's not representative of the top 100. But nonetheless, he's the one historians of today look to as the great lodestone. He serves their purposes more closely than any other. Though I doubt if there's a professor at the University of Virginia in philosophy, anyway, there may be, I'm just exaggerating here for point, but I doubt if there's a professor of philosophy at the University of Virginia who can say in conscience, I hold these truths to be self-evident. The word truth would stump them, because most don't believe there are any such things as truths. There's just your preferences and my preferences. Your views and my views. Your perspectives and my perspectives. There's no truth. And some people even apply that to the American founding. The American founding, this was Tom West's point to you in the last lecture. The American founding, according to some, is not based on universal principles which apply to all human beings everywhere and at all times. The American founding is based on the preferences of the English-speaking people. It's our constitutional soul, as Harvey Mansfield calls his book. It's not the laws of nature and nature's God that apply to everyone. Well, I'm just making the point that that point of view, right and left, that America is just founded on preferences and the accidents of history, that we come from a biblical people of Anglo-Saxon background and common law and so forth. That's the foundation of our rights. Against the view that no, the foundation of our rights is much deeper than that. It's founded in the nature of what a human being is and the nature of what God is. If you look at the top 100, you'll see that that Jefferson for sure, Monroe, maybe even Benjamin Franklin, represented one extreme, 3 out of 100, let's say. In over half of the states at that time, there was an established religion. Far from being non-religious, the people that wrote the first constitutions of the states, some of them insisted that you must be a Trinitarian. Others insisted that you must be a believing Christian. Others insisted that you must believe in the Creator and thinking of God more in Jewish terms. But to think they were atheists or relativists is simply contrary to fact. Now, the new Constitution of Massachusetts, for instance, in 1781, they all had to write new constitutions, you'll remember. after they broke from Britain and from the constitution they had as original colonies. When they were independent, they now needed their own constitution. And there was a fury of writing new constitutions, and John Adams, as I suggested, was the great expert in world constitutions, and he was consulted by most of the states for advice on how to do this and what it should be in it. Anyway, in Massachusetts, Article 3 of the new Constitution provided that there must be schools, and they said religious schools because that's the only schools there were. I mean, the only school teachers in America were ministers of religion, trying to earn a little money on the side. They were the educated people in the colonies. Harvard, Yale were founded to be divinity schools to train up such people. And Massachusetts said there's a mandate, a public obligation to support them. The objection was this is a violation of religious liberty. You're forcing people to pay for religious education, which may not be in their own religion. To which John Adams' people answered. Adams was in France at the time. His people replied, no, it's not an infringement of religious liberty. You don't have to believe it. But if you want law and you want order and you want good habits in the people, you got to pay for it. And this is how you get there. By teaching a proper understanding of human beings in their nature and in their relationship to God. And people who are infused with that not only become better citizens, but they're a necessary requirement for a republic to exist. Unless you have people who believe that it's their God-given duty to take responsibility for their own lives and to take responsibility for the world around them, be of service to others. Unless you have people who believe that, you can't make a republic work. It depends on people capable of self-government. If you don't want to have a tyrannical government making all your decisions, then you have to have an alternative. It's self-government, people making the decisions. And of course, that's what the American experiment was. That's the revolution that occurred in the hearts of Americans, John Adams points out. Americans believe this, that God empowered no one to rule over other people, over the consciences of other people. That is, we are all created equal in the sense that no one is created to rule over us. Therefore, we have to decide how we're going to live and order our own lives. And if we order them in the way our nature is constructed by the Creator, there's every much greater chance of success in achieving both prosperity and liberty. And if not, not. It just won't work. So, the characteristics of this special God who's you can't understand rights as Madison understood them and Jefferson understood them, Mason understood them, unless you understand these characteristics of God. God is defined as spirit and truth. Spirit and truth. He's not a thing that you can make an idol of, an image of. He's not a snake like in Mayan religion. I mean, in the pre-Christian religions, animist religions they're often called, people tried to name the most terrifying animated dynamic in the world as they knew it. The most awe-inspiring. And for some it was these huge snakes of the jungle. You get in their snares, they'll squeeze the life out of you. They're the orderers of life and death. Or the rain, without which you lose your crops and the whole civilization dies out. Or a tree or a stone. That's not the Jewish or Christian God. Those are idols, unworthy of human beings to worship. What human beings are called upon to worship is the Logos, an insight, a force of reason and understanding, which infuses all things. A mind, where mind is interpreted, again, as insight. I mean, the live activity of the mind, not a calm, dead mind, but the live activity of being. Do you know the joy when you're studying something and you can't quite get it and all of a sudden it clicks, that little light that goes on? That's such a joy, especially if it's been a long time coming and you finally get it. Well, that's what God is, that light. in everything. And we have always believed, even Aristotle and Plato believed, that to have that insight and fire our own minds is to participate in the life of God. So that's the first. You need a religion which looks to God as spirit and truth, as insight and judgment. Second, this Creator is a judge of consciences, not merely of our outward gestures or behavior. He wants to be worshipped in spirit and in truth, according to reason and conviction, not according to pretended piety or shredding your garments. He doesn't look at your gestures. He looks at what's in your heart and mind. And beyond that, he looks at what's in your actions. He's the judge, capable of discerning those differences. Third, he's the judge for whom conscience is not coerced. He wants the conscience of human beings to be free so that they would be capable of friendship. Are you following the argument with me? It's a bit abstract and demanding, I realize, but someday you'll have a chance to read it and study it, and all of a sudden the insight will come, and you'll be filled with rapturous joy. Anyway. Fourth, this God must be one whose acceptance by women and men must be free. I mean, this God can only be recognized by the use of reason and conviction, by the evidence of our own minds. Now, people come to this evidence in different rhythms. And there are people who don't see that there is a God, or why there should be a God, or whatever. That's true. And in your own life, you can see when these things began to be more clear to you and when you had difficulties and so forth. There's a progression in human life. So we can't judge one another. Let each be judged in the presence of God, who does see what's going on in the heart and mind. But this must be a God accepting whom comes out of evidence in our own minds, not submission of our own wills, not blind submission of our own wills. But a God who puts us in touch with the intelligibility, the intelligence that suffuses everything in the world. I mean, it took a long time for humans to discover these microphones and the airwaves and how to bring them into being. But you're not entitled to have any doubt that everything is capable of being understood in time. If humans apply their mind to it, try to follow the clues that the Creator left behind, they should discover all sorts of wonders and capacities that we haven't even scratched the surface of yet. And there's a fifth characteristic of this God. The Creator to whom the creature owes worship, love, thanksgiving, based on the evidence of the creature's own mind. And that's that this God must allow for personal liberty, for variation, for dissent, for difference, just in the way I've been describing. People come along at different stages in their own life pilgrimage. I'm sure you all know in your own life when you became more religious, more willing to serve, and when this part of life didn't attract you so much. Well, you know, autobiography is the literary form invented by Christians, because we know our lives are a voyage or a pilgrimage. And this God that creatures are called upon to worship and to serve by reason and conviction is a God of autobiographies, and they differ, if you follow my reasoning again. Now, this is the God, it's not my reasoning. I'm trying to replicate the reasoning of Madison and Jefferson in their argument. And then the Virginians go on. Oh, by the way, I should say, it's not necessary to be a Christian or Jew to understand this, but you do need to know something about Jewish and Christian conceptions if you want to understand it the way they understood it. You have to see the way they use the word creature and creator and right and duty. And those only come out of the Jewish and Christian tradition. At least that's my proposition before you. You may not accept it, but I think you must be led to accept it if you look at the evidence. So the Virginians go on about this duty, following the evidence of our own mind. And therefore, all men are equally entitled to the free exercise of religion according to the dictates of conscience. There it is again, conscience. This is what the Lord God, the Creator, looks at, our conscience, in spirit and in truth. And then they conclude, and it is the mutual duty of all to practice Christian forbearance, love, and charity toward each other. Now, to your ear, which religion does that allude to? And it is the mutual duty of all to practice Christian forbearance, love, and charity toward each other. I mean, if you didn't get it, that they were talking about the Jewish and Christian God, you should get it now. I mean, they say it outright. Now, let me jump ahead to Madison's reflections on this 11 years later in the Remonstrance. You remember that Patrick Henry, the governor, commanded that everybody be taxed to pay the salaries of religious ministers, because there was no more established church in Virginia. The state wasn't paying these salaries. Who's going to pay them? And how are we going to have teachers if somebody doesn't pay them? And so the only fair thing is to ask everybody to contribute. Otherwise, we don't have schools. If we don't have schools, we don't have a republic. And then he said, now those who find support for a religion not their own, abhor it, they don't have to pay. Well, that only made it worse, I mean, as you can imagine. And it was going to cause conflict among the different churches who paid and who didn't pay, and whether that's fair or not, whether their ministers can then receive monies from this. Anyway. So Madison remonstrated against this. He objected to it. He protested and tried to get people to sign it, his remonstrance. And again, this is the argument that he makes. It's really very important. It's very dear to the ACLU, but I do think they exactly misconceive it. Here's the way Madison explains how he came to his notion of the right of religious liberty. Because we hold it for a fundamental and undeniable truth that religion, or the duty which we owe to our Creator, and by now you're familiar with that, and the manner of discharging it can be directed only by reason and conviction, not by force or violence. In other words, he's merely quoting from 1776, the Declaration of Religious Liberty, which he worked on. So he picks up this fundamental sentence again. It's the second time now in the documents that it's picked up again. The religion then of every man, Madison goes on, must be left to the conviction and conscience of every man. And it is the right of every man to exercise it as he may dictate. It's his duty to worship God in this way by reason and conviction. And if it's his duty, it must be his right. Who would dare to interfere? Now, you want to interfere with God's relationship to an individual? The state want to interfere? Better not. So, if human beings have a duty personal to them, not able to be made by their mother or their father or their brother or their sister, they have to make it, then nobody has the right to interfere with that. It's too sacred. It's too dear to the Creator. It's what the Creator cares most about. So if you have a duty, there must be a right. That is, there's an immunity. Nobody else can interfere in this. And then Madison goes on, it's an unalienable right. Well, it's unalienable first because what is here a right on men's part is a duty to the Creator. And men owe this duty not to interfere here because this is what the Creator most wants, that men should come to Him by reason and conviction. So it's found that rights and duties are correlative here. It is unalienable second also because what is here, I've already said that. It is the duty of every man to render the Creator such homage and such only as he believes to be acceptable to him. And we have a duty, and this duty is precedent both in order of time and in degree of obligation to the claims of civil society. In other words, You know, John Locke had a theory about civil society grows out of a compact among human beings. We, in effect, not really, but in effect, sign a covenant. I mean, you never signed this covenant, I never did, but in our ancestors we did, is the idea. When, it's not, date's not given. I mean, it's a sort of mythical construct, but it explains the underlying rationale. We signed a covenant not to use violence against one another. That belongs only to the state according to due process. And therefore, rights begin with civil society. That's Locke's theory. Once you've signed this covenant, that's the origin of rights. That's not Madison's view or Jefferson's. They argue that rights grow out of something precedent to civil society, out of our relationship to God. Are you following me that? They're arguing that rights grow out of our duty to God, to follow him with reason and conviction. And that's precedent to civil society, as God is precedent to civil society. There being no creator, there's no civil society. There's no human beings, period. Before there's a civil society, we have this duty. It's precedent even to the family. Neither mother, nor father, nor brother, nor sister can take over your responsibility for your own decision, yes or no, in relationship to God. The conclusion to this chain of thought is inevitable. The duty flows from the self-evident relation of creature to creator. This creator is the governor of the universe. Before, and I'm taking Madison again, before any man can be considered a member of civil society, he must be considered as a subject of the governor of the universe. Does the ACLU really mean to embrace the remonstrant? Subject to the governor of the universe? Is the ACLU willing to go on record that there is a governor of the universe? Religion is the duty to the Creator, who is also the governor of the universe. Now, if you have the duty, then you must have the right. There's no sense in having a duty to the Creator unless you have the right to exercise it, according to conscience. And this is how the founders, this is how they thought. This is how they came to the notion of rights to begin with. Not every culture comes to a notion of rights. Well, I hope I've said enough to persuade you of the most difficult part of the argument, that at least it's worth looking at the argument they gave for religious liberty, to see if it can be held in the light of any other religion except the Jewish Christian religion, relying on conviction and conscience. And the duty which is self-evident, if you know what a creature is and a creator is, the creature owes the duty, not the creator, of praise and thanksgiving and gratitude. Now, let me go into the easier parts of the lecture. Take a deep breath, relax. Let me begin with a story. I'm going to tell several little stories to illustrate the point. This is a notation in the diary of the minister who lived across the street from the White House. I presume that means the Episcopal Church that President Obama attended last week or the week before, right across Lafayette Park. Thomas Jefferson, with a red prayer book under his arm, was walking from the White House to the Capitol building one day to attend the church service there that was held there. A man along the way, and people think it's the minister himself, asked him, "Which way are you walking, Mr. Jefferson?" "To church, sir." The man says to him, "You going to church, Mr. Jefferson? You don't believe a word in it, sir." Now, Jefferson didn't deny that. What he says was, "Sir, no nation has ever yet existed or been governed without religion, nor can be. The Christian religion is the best religion that has been given to man." And he means it's the best foundation of republican government, as he says in other places. "And I, as chief magistrate of this nation, am bound to give it the sanction of my example." Now, what I like about this quote so much is that it's probably true that some people don't need religion. I mean, it's certainly true that people often say that, an increasing number these days. If you want to appear sophisticated on television, that's what you do. You say, religion is for people who are childish and need a crutch. Real grown-up people don't need a crutch. In other words, religion is a form of neurosis. Mr. Jefferson, you don't believe a word in it. Jefferson doesn't argue with him about that. He doesn't believe much about the Jewish and Christian. He writes a version of the New Testament intended to be distributed at government expense to all the Indian tribes of America. And he takes out all the miracles, just leaves in the moral teaching of the New Testament. But he says, unless you understand this moral teaching, you can't understand Republican government. So he believed he should bring the supportive government, not infringement of liberty by government, not the repression of religion, but the supportive government for nourishing this living root of the free society. Take away the duty of conscience and the right to liberty of conscience that follows from it, and the concept of a free republic loses its intellectual coherence. In other words, Jefferson is not protesting that he believes everything in the Bible, but he is arguing that there's no better support for Republican governance than a view of human responsibility and human liberty that's consistent with reason and conviction. Now another story. Just before his 25th birthday, young James Madison heard troubling news about an event that occurred not far from where he lived in central Virginia. A group of Baptists had gathered in a declivity on a hillside which formed a natural stadium. So you had a good loud speaking system, so to speak. The echoes were contained. When a posse of Anglicans rode up, now I love that expression, a posse of Anglicans. If that isn't an oxymoron, I don't know what is. But they pulled the minister from his pulpit, it was a mobile pulpit, and strung him up to the tree and had him lashed until his back was bloody. And then they threw him in jail. Now, during this period, Madison discovered there were more than 45 Baptist ministers languishing in jail for preaching the gospel without a license from the state. But their argument was, we don't need a license from the state. Our license comes from God. And we're not going to ask it from the state. So they were kind of an impasse. Well, Madison, not a Baptist, was touched by these stories. He came to the defense of the Baptists and eagerly added his contribution to the Virginia Declaration of Rights of 1776, particularly the part of religious liberty, which I mentioned before. It was Madison that added that sentence, the duty of the creature to the Creator, and to follow it in conscience, in reason and conviction. Then it happened that Patrick Henry, the governor of Virginia, reassigned Madison in anger at him for his remonstrance, reassigned him to a new district where he didn't know anybody practically. In this new district that Madison had to run in next election, there were 2,200 voters, of whom 700 or 800 were Baptists. Well, he now had their votes. Patrick Henry didn't quite realize this. So Madison had to have less than half of the remainder to win the election easily. So he did win. He knew he owed it to the Baptists. And when he went back to Congress, therefore, to serve, the Baptists, this is after the Constitution had been accepted, they insisted that when he went back for his term, he had to bring into an amendment into it of religious liberty. And Madison said, you don't understand, we don't need such an amendment. Your religious liberty is intact. Because in the Constitution, we put in writing all the powers that we give to government. And only those things that are in writing does government have power over. All the rest are retained by the people. And we don't give them power over religion. So that's retained by you. And the Baptists said to him, Mr. Madison, you may understand it, and we may understand it, but we doubt that the Anglicans understand it. We want it written down. So he went back to Congress, instructed by the Baptists of Southern Virginia, to fight for a First Amendment. Now, does the ACLU put that in its pipe and smoke it? That we owe the First Amendment to the Baptists of Southern Virginia, Jerry Falwell's own people? American history is wonderful. Now, nobody in Congress wanted to fight out another philosophical argument as they had for the Constitution. They needed a post office, they needed roads, they needed canals, they needed an organization of government institutions and administration. Now was the time for practicality, not for a philosophical argument about the grounds of religious rights, possibly divisive. But Madison was an amazing politician, and he got it through. Well, the third story. Well, I've already told you this, that during the Jefferson administration, the largest church service in the District of Columbia was held every Sunday in the Capitol building. Not only was Jefferson often in attendance, but he also arranged that the Marine Band would provide the music at government expense. Where was the ACLU when we needed them? They could have stopped these precedents in the very beginning. They overlooked it. But this is the Jefferson they make a hero of, providing the music for the largest church service in the United States. And later, when the Supreme Court building was built, the second largest church service in America took place there every Sunday. Almost always a Protestant service, needless to say, but on occasion, twice, provided over by a Catholic priest. And the intention was to be open to all the citizens, although the religion that best taught the habits necessary for a republican government were the Jewish and Christian. Now, I want to mention, I'm really cutting short a lot, but I want to mention 4 other fundamental narratives that spring out of Judaism and Christianity by which to understand our place in the world, by which the founders understood their place in the world. I call these the 4 Hebrew foundational narratives. They don't come from the Enlightenment. They don't come from Kant. They don't come from Locke. They don't come from Hobbes. They come from the Jewish part of the Bible and the Christian affirmation of it. First is that the whole universe was made for a purpose and is launched on a voyage of progress. Thy kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven. More and more. There's a task for the human race to build a city on the hill. So you have to understand history not as the ancients did, as a cycle of the same old thing over and over again. The same thing happening over and over again. Well, you hope to get back to the beginning where the great heroes and gods were, and to renew that. So you circle over and over back to the beginning. That's what Greece and Rome tried to do. They called attention to the gods and tried to recreate our fidelity to the gods. Christianity and Judaism are different. History is like an arrow. It's going somewhere. And it can have failures and reverses, but there's a purpose to it. That's an entirely different view. And that's why the American founders thought they were adding to the progress of the human race by contributing this idea of religious liberty. They were adding something original, and that's the task of every generation, to keep taking another step in this voyage. It's a different way of thinking. And it means we owe obligations to the future, to put it that way. We have a duty to think about the future because we have reason, capacity to understand principles and to understand what abuses of those principles will lead to. I think this coheres very well with Tom West's lecture. If you look at Federalist 14, I'm not going to stop to read it now. I'd love to, and I'm very tempted to, but I think it would take me too long. But make a point of looking up the last paragraphs of Federalist 14, in which the founders point out that let no one deny that we didn't pay respect to all the great lessons of the past, all the great experiments. But let no one deny either we contributed our own originality, that we have reared a government without model on the face of the earth. So they were very jealous of their own originality. And that can only be if you believe it's right and natural for history to make progress. And why would Mr. Wheatley contribute to this new center at the university if he didn't believe progress could be made? We could be better off in 20 or 30 years if we have this center than we would be without it. That's what moves people now, today, in the Jewish and Christian period of time. Secondly, another fundamental narrative introduced by Christianity and Judaism, and first by Judaism, all things are made intelligently. In other words, human beings should expect that there's somewhere a key which unifies every field of intelligence in history. What Einstein was looking for, the unified field theory. That the fundamental principle of the universe, physical universe, will be simple. And it create a fundamental unity. You always look for the greatest simplicity. That's the road to truth, because it's all united. It all springs out of one mind, the Creator's mind. So it all has to be related. And that means human beings should use their intelligence to discover new grains of wheat, new strains of wheat that produce more grains per stock than old strains. That's why Lincoln commanded that every new territory open around colleges and universities, the land-grant universities, the agricultural universities, the mining universities, Texas A&M, and so forth. Because human beings were supposed to use their minds to understand the secrets of creation and thereby create much greater wealth. Okay. Third, that humans are made to be free. We've already covered this, so I don't need to linger on. So that they may be invited into friendship with God. For the Creator, freedom is essential to the construction of the world. There has to be room for it. There have to be accidents and chances and contingencies, so that not everything happens by necessity, but there's scope for human action in it. And the purpose of the cosmos is friendship. If the founders hadn't believed this, to repeat myself, they would never have been able to make war in Great Britain and hope to prevail. It wasn't reasonable. It didn't make common sense. Finally, life is a field of battle, suffering, and trial. John Adams has a beautiful passage on the sufferings of his grandfather and the generation before that, and how they labored in the toil of these harsh fields of New England to have them bear grain and fruit, and how much they did this for the sake of their children would be to come, and for a liberty, for a new society of liberty, a new world of liberty, and how this hope infused everything they did, but how much suffering they had to go through to do it, how every generation faced trials and had to pass the tests of its own time. You know, Judaism and Christianity and the Church of the Latter-day Saints does not predict a world of only happy endings and without suffering and without pain. Not at all. Not at all. You can't understand the stories without understanding the pain and the suffering and the trials. Well, I think I've said enough. I have about twice that much. In written form, I can do twice that much, but I can't in an oral form. And honestly, I just beg you, take a founder, any one of the founders, the top 100, and study his, in the case of Abigail, her religious convictions, and please. You'll find out that 98 out of 100 of them are far more religious, and not just religious, but Jewish and Christian, than Tom Paine or even Thomas Jefferson. That if we talk about the religion of the founders and we look at the way they expressed themselves, you can't help seeing they rose by that second wing of the eagle, by Jewish and Christian presuppositions and convictions and principles. And the whole experiment doesn't make any sense without that. Now, how we could have lost that in the last 100 years, I don't understand, but we did. And it's I hope it's part of the mission of this institution to recover that as a vital force in American life. Without it, I'm afraid we're lost. Well, thank you very much.